My research interests are in hydrology, ecosystem dynamics, and landscape geomorphology. Today, I'm going to talk about Landlab Earth Surface Modeling Toolkit. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it fine?
Yep, we can see it fine.
Okay. So Landlab was a project funded by the National Science Foundation to University of Colorado, Tulane University, and University of Washington. It's a Python-based Earth surface modeling toolkit in which you can essentially develop models of the dynamics of the Earth system. We have landlab.github.io. That's where that's the GitHub page. That's the GitHub landing page for Landlab. And we'll see some examples using Landlab from GitHub. And then we have some of the components can be run on HydroShare and so on. So the gist of Landlab is that when you look around a number of Earth surface models, whether this is a hydrology model, hydrodynamics model, glacier model, they require like the conservation of mass, conservation of or the control volume equations for routing sediment, for routing water, and so on. And the idea of Landlab is to create some of these rules as components and make this available as a community tool. So it's an open source Python language programming library. It supports efficient. There was a question? Was there a question? Okay. It supports efficient creation and or coupling of two numerical models. It's geared towards Earth surface dynamics. It's like similar to SUMA if you were available aware of the SUMA framework for hydrological modeling. So the Landlab provides a grid creation tools. You first create the landscape grid, and then on top of it, it uses different types of gridding schemes like hex model, radial model, and raster model. And then it has components that that does only one process. A component is a model of a single process, such as flow routing, evapotranspiration, soil moisture, and so on. And components have a standard interface and can be combined by writing a short Python script. So essentially, when you put together components that interact with the raster model grid through Python scripts, then you essentially develop a model for a certain process. Then you initialize the models using input grid and parameters and update the relevant fields of the process that you're modeling. These are some of the examples of the components. We have vegetation dynamics component, we have fires, landslides, storm generation, stochastic storm generation, soil creep, channel incision, and soil moisture, just to give you some examples. We can also read data from existing data, like from the vegetation data from national land cover and land use data sets. We can read the gridded elevation data for existing DEMs and so on. And we can write gridded outputs to files like netcdf and plot our results using matplotlib. This is a general framework of Landlab. On the left, you have the gridding tools, raster model grid, or any type of different structured and non-structured grids. Components on the right, outlined with blue, and then the utilities down in green. So this is sort of a general framework of the Landlab operation. And how this operates is that you have the grid, and then you have the components with given parameters. The components work on the grid, and then the the components change a state variable, and those state variables are recorded in different fields, like field 1 and 2 and field n. But that field could be a vegetation cover, it could be soil moisture, and so on. I'm going to skip this one. So I'll show you some examples about existing models in Landlab. Landlab has a number of landscape evolution models that uses different processes like landsliding and soil creep and different types of fluvial erosion. It has flow routing. Like I said, there's the landslide risk component, and we have a cellular automaton component. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples from Dr. Nathan Lyons from Tulane University, who was a postdoc working on Landlab. And I think he's currently a research scientist. And really, I will be showing a couple of examples after this for landscape evolution, on landscape evolution. So if you think about a landscape without any erosion processes, you will look something like this. The uplift process would raise the topography, raise the elevation of the topography. You will end up having something like plateau. If you add fluvial processes, rivers incising the landscape, but that's the only process. So that's the up in the equation. This is the change in elevation. You have an uplift process and an incision process. This is a simple rule for detachment limited stream incision. You get dendritic channel networks like that. But if you add more like hill slope processes like soil creep, rain splash erosion, maybe small scale landslides in a soil dominated landscapes, you have less dendritic channel network, but more smoothed at the hilltops. It looks like a more realistic landscape. So this is one great example of use of Landlab in sort of exploring different process contribution on the evolution of the landscape. Using Landlab, you can model vegetation dynamics. This is an example of leaf area index that shows how green the vegetation is. You can map the leaf area index. You can map soil moisture. Down below, there's a soil moisture tracer. Traces modeled on comparison with comparison to observations. This is an example of vegetation dynamics using Landlab. Like I said, Landlab has a cellular automaton component. What you're seeing on this is the application of Landlab cellular automaton component driven by stochastic storms. And each of these grid cells, the landscape is composed of 5 meter by 5 meter grid resolution. On the left, you're seeing a flat topography, flat domain for conditions of New Mexico, in which you probably have some sparse grass and mostly shrub. This is what the Landlab gives you with a little bit of calibration. On the right, now we replaced the flat topography with an actual topography that has north and south facing slopes, similar to what you see in the real world example with juniper pines on the north facing slopes. The model can predict the juniper pine on the north facing slopes just based on the solar radiation input and some of the vegetation stress variables that related to the soil moisture and the water stress. Another example now is using of fires in Landlab. There's a lot of argument, there's a lot of debate about the role of fires in keeping the grasslands as grasslands or savannas. With the human impact of grazing, maybe fire suppression, we see that grasslands across the world are changing towards more, or savannas and grasslands across the world are changing towards more woody vegetation, more like forest lands. And that had a lot of implication on the nutrient balance of the systems. It had a lot of implication of the erosion dynamics. But in this process, some of the landscapes could also completely become a desert landscape because of just the balances between the fires and the land management. This is a very important issue, and then we create this tool to study the influence of human impact and fire management. In this simulation, what you're seeing is that the white color is when the fire strikes the landscape. It starts with a lightning strike, and then it expands outward as a result of the cell-by-cell communication of the between cells and the probability of fires expanding to the next cell. This is what a landslide model architecture looks like in Landlab. Like we said, we have processes, and then we have model input field variables, and we have a model driver. This is a paper led by Stroud et al. 2018. Landlab can read DEM soil data like from Surgo or Statsco, land cover data from National Land Cover Land Use Data Set. And it can also read hydrological information from existing hydrological models. In this case, we were using variable infiltration capacity model. And Christina and Rhonda has been working on updating Landlab to accept output from distributed models like the DHSVM model. Here's an example of the landslide risk calculated at the regional scale using Landlab. And there's another example. In this one, you're looking at fires impacting eolian processes. And that eolian process feeds back to the vegetation health. In some of the Southwest landscapes, the shrub type of vegetation collect a lot of dust, eolian dust, and then dust settles and forms so-called mountains of fertility. And with that mountains of fertility, actually shrubs can grow better and expand themselves. So then that leads to sort of the shrub expansion. But when there's land use disturbance, or when there's a large fire, then these islands of fertility disperse in place across the landscape. But that leads to very interesting dynamics of vegetation persistence. So the shrubland becomes persistent to shrubland, or the grassland may become persistent to grassland, depending on this fire dynamics and as it relates to the eolian processes. And this is a paper led by Christina van der Gulle, published in 2018 on in environmental modeling and software. Landlab is available on HydroShare. And in this paper, Christina and co-authors published a code that is reusable, rescalable, and reproducible for different applications. So the same code with a little bit of modification, we showed how you can reuse the code. So I will show some examples of Landlab from using the Landlab GitHub.io. By the way, you can find this presentation on the notes that so it's available on HydroShare. So I will show some examples just by clicking the Landlab GitHub.io. If you want to try it on your own, then this is a good time to get your browser up. And so going to Landlab GitHub.io. So we're going to go to, so this is the GitHub page, landing page for Landlab. So we're going to go to tutorials. By the way, do you have any questions at this point before we get into the tutorials? Okay, hearing none. So we can launch notebooks online, Landlab notebooks here. So we have two sets of notebooks. As a beginner, you click this one here, Landlab. So it lands into a binder notebook file. So as an example, as a beginner tutorial, I was going to show how to read a DEM as a Landlab grid. And then, let's see. Okay, so in this beginner tutorials, if you want to explore how to read a model from Landlab grid, then it would be, where is that? Was it in the other one? Sorry, I must have. I'm going to go back there again. Let's do this first binder, which is the actual tutorials. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes, we can see it. It's nice. We're following you. Thank you.
Okay. So what I was going to get to is that okay, there was how to read a DM as a Landlab grid, but I was going to do like a coupled rainfall runoff model in Landlab. Maybe this also shows how to read the DEM. So the other one will be better seen on this one. So I'm going to open that coupled rainfall runoff model. Okay, so we're in welcome to the Landlab notebooks. So here we have, what is it? Coupled rainfall runoff model with overland flow. Can you guys see the Jupyter notebook?
Yes, yes. This
Okay.
is showing up quite in a good way.
Okay. So this is a rainfall runoff model, which means that we create a rainfall surface and then we run that rainfall surface through a routing of runoff. So let's click on this and see it run. So Shift Enter. Why is it? Okay, so this is importing Landlab files to read the Esri data, ASCII file for the DEM. And we're reading in a DEM. This is our DEM for a little watershed. This is the same watershed that I showed in the eco-hydrology examples with the north and south facing slope with different vegetation. And then we'll just we'll generate a rainfall input file for this. And then this is the rainfall input file. This is a random file with a given input seed and mean precipitation. So this random seed is 26 in this one. If you change the random seed to, let's say, 50, then you're going to get a more uniform pattern like this. So we now have a rainfall pattern which can be calibrated depending on the basin of interest that you have. And this could actually be fed by a model of like surface runoff generation, like the Soil Conservation Service runoff models, or any kind of other model that can be run before this step, and then this could be added as runoff. And then we'll route this using a routing scheme that is based on the San Vernon equation. So this runoff will be routed on the landscape. And what we're plotting here is the stage in the river, that is the water depth in the river. As you can see, like you can see the channel network, the water is routed into the network, and you can see at some places the water depth gets as high as 2 meters or maybe more than that. Seems like looking at this, maybe the peak stage. The peak stage will be visualized at the outlet in the final slide. So for different timestamps of the hydrograph, this Jupyter notebook generates maps of the stage in the river or in the little channel. And then here we can now plot, we can plot the hydrograph at the outlet. This is the stage hydrograph, but you can convert that stage hydrograph by knowing the slope of the cell. Then in the roughness parameter, you can essentially calculate the discharge. And there's a way to actually spit out the discharge here, but this one is looking at the flood stage. So this shows that given a reasonably significant amount of rainfall that is consistent with some of the monsoon precipitation in New Mexico, the flood stage can go up to 1.4 meters at the outlet. That's assuming that there will be no infiltration. So you have a fairly significant amount of rainfall that is falling in a very short amount of time, and you have a high stage. So, but and then the continuation of this notebook also shows how you can essentially build different rules for the overland flow and then compare the different methods. So I'm gonna leave it there and move to a different tutorial on landscapes. So these can be offered as class tutorials and can also be used research by carefully changing the input fields and so on. So I'm gonna go File and Close and Halt this kernel and leave this page. And I will show another example for using Landlab to explore hill slope and channel evolution. That's the landscape evolution model in Landlab. What you will see here is that, so we're looking at hill slope and channel with Landlab. And hill slope and channel evolution is essentially, sorry, I clicked Lab by accident. Oh, we didn't need this one. So like the basic landscapes evolve as a function of, like I said, the fluvial processes like that incise the landscape and changes the elevation field. This is the rate of change of elevation. This is an incision rule that forms the channel. And this is a rule that produces sediments, erodes sediments from the hill slopes and puts into the channel like a soil creep process or maybe small scale landslides and rain splash erosion and so on. And there's the uplift. So what we will, this formulation gives us like two parameters to change the form of the landscape. If you think that in the case of there's no soils, then the second parameter becomes like 0, and the landscape only evolves as a function of an uplift and the incision rule. So when you run this script with having no soil on the rock incised by rivers, this is a simulation of an arbitrary domain. I mean, it's a theoretical domain of 15 kilometers by 15 kilometers. So you have an uplifted landscape, and then the channels are incising in the absence of any significant soil. This is like a bedrock landscape. But if you include soils, then the landscape is smoothed out, the channel drainage density is reduced. So the landscape, more like a natural landscape than this one, more like a soil-dominated landscape. But I'm going to go back and show how this can be run. We don't need this guy here. So then in this tutorial, this is a good example of how you couple a model in Landlab. So we have two components, the channel incision component and the hill slope erosion components. Right, so we'll be coupling that in this one. Again, we need to plotting functions because we will be plotting the results. We're importing the Landlab components. In this one, we have we do fill the depressions as we route the flow. We would like to use a flow accumulator that accumulates the flow downstream. We have linear diffusion, that's for the hill slope processes, and we have stream power erosion. So we're essentially coupling like 4 different components in this one. Okay, so let's introduce this to our code. Now we're given input parameters. Like I said, this is the uplift rate. If you want to do something like more like the cascades, this is uplift rate of the cascade is roughly 3 millimeters per year, or the mean annual erosion rate long term. So I put like 3 here. And then you have incision coefficients for the rivers incising the landscape, and you have a coefficient for the hill slopes kicking in sediment from like landslides and soil creep and so on. So we introduce the parameters now to our model, and then let's create a domain. So we need to give the number of cells that we are interested in. Let's put 150 cells. And this is the cell size. Let's put a 50-meter cell size because we want the simulation to run fairly quickly. If you want to be a more realistic landscape, you probably increase these numbers to get a more sizable landscape. I'm going to put this jack up a little bit. And then let's create our domain. And then this is the initialization of how long we want to run the model. And then we pick the system will start from a flat topography initialized by random perturbation so that the flow can be routed and the incision begins. If you have a smooth topography, you're not going to get realistic looking lane. You may not get sort of reasonable incision, or you may get some funny looking landscape. So after that, then we initializing our components. So here FRR will stand for flow accumulation. SVR will stand for stream power eroder. And then the parameters are obtained from the previously entered numbers. Now we're looping. These are the years. Each of these represent like thousands of years, 1,000, 2,000, and then the landscape is going to be iterating for 1,000,000 years. So we're running this for 1,000,000 years. This may take a little bit of time. Of course, depending on the complication you built in your model, this process will take time. If you want to throw in some vegetation on this, if you want to include like fluvial erosion vegetation interactions, then the computational time, of course, would increase. I think we're almost done. Okay, so this step is over. As I can see, we're 1,000,000 years, and then the number turned from asterisk to a number. And let's plot our landscapes. So this started from a initially flat domain, and then I think I might have put the hill slope diffusion a lot, so the system could not really incise much. So then, since if I want to change the parameter a little bit, let's put a smaller hill slope diffusion and run it again. That means that a higher hill slope diffusion means that there is like small animals, there's soil creep, there's rain splash, keep kicking the sediment into the channels. So the channels cannot really incise and carve the landscape because there's so much sediment coming from the hill slopes. So it's all mass balance between the processes that smooth the landscape and the ones that incise the landscape. All right, we're done. Now we have a lot natural looking landscapes. You can see the streams formed, and these are the hilltops over. That's plotting the elevation field between 0. You can think of this as an island uplifted, like there's sharks around it, there's sea around it, and there's an uplifted island. And then the mountaintop goes a little bit more than 2,005 meters. So it's a fairly decent mountain. It's a small island, small mountains island.